My name is Chris Doyle. I'm the director of Caabu, and I'm really delighted to welcome you this afternoon to this Caabu Online briefing. And it's my great pleasure to introduce to you today Janine di Giovanni. But before I do that, just to say a couple of things that we'd like you please to mute your microphones if you haven't already done so we can have the best sound possible. And Janine and I will be having a Q&A, a conversation. If you could put your questions in the chat, questions rather than points and so forth to the author, and we'll try to get through as many as possible. So, right, without further ado, Janine, a very warm welcome. And we're here today because of the launch of her book, The Vanishing, yet another book. I think it's your 9th book. It is entitled The Vanishing, the Twilight of Christianity in the Middle East. And it's eminently readable. And Janine is one of my favorite reporters from the Middle East. And in keeping with her style, it's very much about what she experiences, the communities, the people that she brings to life and humanizes and tells their story, and even comes back to visit them years later or try to find them. She's a multi-award winning journalist and author, senior fellow and lecturer at Yale University's Jackson Institute for Global Affairs. And, you know, in addition to the Middle East, she's reported all over the world, including in several countries that, of course, faced genocide, Rwanda, the Balkans. So she really brings an extraordinary wealth of knowledge, as well as a fervent passion to her writing. And you can see the rest of her books. They're all available, I should say, on our Caabu Online Bookshop. It's published by Bloomsbury, so the link is on the webpage. We like to support independent publishing, you can see there, and that's a tiny little bit of money for each purchase goes towards Caabu, so thank you for anyone who does purchase through that. I would also heartily recommend at the same time also Janine's last book as well on Syria, which is also, if you haven't already read it, shame on you, please do so. So without further ado, Janine, a warm welcome once again. I'm just going to ask if somebody could turn off their microphone, if they haven't. You've written this book, and the first thing that strikes me was how personal it is. I mean, the front and the end books are very much about you and your faith, you know, during COVID, etc. And then you take us really through this journey in various chapters on Iraq, Syria, Gaza, Egypt. Why now? What led you to do this now? To sort of spill your thoughts on these communities, you know, in the Middle East.
Hi, Chris. Hi, everyone, and thank you so much. I really appreciate you coming out in the middle of the day to hear about The Vanishing. Chris, it was a really interesting journey for me writing this book because, as you know, and you and I met, I think you were one of the first people I met when I started reporting from the Middle East, which is 30 years ago. So it really dates us. But from my very beginning of the work I did in the Middle East, I was aware of Christian communities. Having been brought up a Catholic, a Roman Catholic, and having gone to Catholic school nearly my whole life, it was always extraordinary to me to interview or to work alongside or to read about these ancient people, because of course, this is the birthplace of Jesus Christ and the prophets. As I continued my work, especially in Iraq in the time of Saddam Hussein, I was really aware of how precarious their situation was, especially the Assyrian, the Chaldean communities in the north near Mosul, and how absolutely fragile they were. Now, I'll go more into depth about that, but I wanted to answer your question directly about how personal it was. Well, the book wasn't meant to be a personal journey of my own faith by any means. I spent 4 years basically focused on the research of it and going back and forth to these places and talking to people. And it had kind of started after the ISIS onslaught in 2014. But then when I actually sat down to write, and I mean, any of you who are writers out there know that like half your work is the field work, and then you come back with your notebooks and you sit at your desk, and that's the really hard part when you try to unravel it and turn it into a book. Just as I was doing that, COVID started. And I have to tell you that, I mean, I am called a war reporter. And so people always assume I'm fearless, which is absolutely not true. I'm afraid of everything. But I really, really was terrified of what was happening in the world in the first months of the pandemic, because I felt that there was this invisible enemy spinning around the globe. And, you know, think back to that time, how insecure we were. You know, we had no idea when vaccines would come out. I was in France at the time, which had an extremely strict lockdown. Like, literally, you couldn't go out of your house without a paper. There were armed police everywhere. You couldn't go out on the streets. You had to, you know, only be able to go to the chemist. So I was terrified. And I found myself going back to the faith of my childhood with that kind of intensity. And it also helped that I was living, I was sheltering in a very, very remote part of France, a village in the Vercors, which had been heavily, heavily fought over in World War II, with French cousins who were extremely religious, Roman Catholic. So they, you know, they had like built little altars to Our Lady. They were praying twice a day. So it was in this atmosphere that I was writing this book. So it started, you know, kind of to my publisher's surprise, out with my own personal musings on faith and resilience and fear and insecurity. And then I wove in the sections on Iraq, Syria, Egypt, and Gaza. Sorry for that rather long-winded answer.
Not at all. Only you would say that the hard part was writing the book as opposed to reporting from the carnage of 2003 Iraq, or, you know, the ISIS, massacres in both Iraq and Syria. And of course, that would be enough to terrify anybody. Now, you call it The Vanishing, and you're talking about the twilight of, you know, Christianity in this region. And of course, you know, these ancient communities. I mean, how bad do you think it has got now? I mean, people have been talking for some time now. I think back to earlier books like William Dalrymple's From the Holy Mountain, or you've got Gerard Russell's Heirs to Forgotten Kingdom, and other books that have talked about it. But I suppose none have been quite so bleak as yours. I mean, you really are sort of putting out there the idea that these communities, in certain areas at least, could actually vanish and disappear. Do you think, you know, that's a bit melodramatic, or do you think that really this is a siren call, I suppose, to try to save them?
No, I don't think it's melodramatic. If you look at the numbers, for instance, Iraqi Christians, there was, in the time of the last census, and again, numbers are very difficult because the census taken is more than 40 years old, and it was taken in the time of Saddam, reckon, you know, close to 1.5 million Christians in Iraq. Now, post ISIS, very difficult to ascertain, but something like 100,000. Syria, again, undergoing a bitter and brutal war. The numbers have radically dropped, especially in Aleppo, where many of the Armenian Christians have had to flee. Gaza, once entirely Christian in the 4th century, 800 Christians left. And in Egypt, General Sisi is definitely promoting a kind of an urge or a wish for many of the Copts to migrate. So no, I mean, I feel the reason I wrote it is that social scientists that I've spoken to who specialize in the region believe that in some cases, such as Iraq, given the numbers and the way they are drastically plummeting, in 100 years, we might not have these communities there, or we will have, ghost communities, villages where people have migrated. Gaza, the 800 Christians struggling to hold on, caught between Hamas, who are at war, of course, with the Palestinian Authority, so they make everything difficult for all civilians there, not just Christians. And also, of course, they're still subjected to the Israeli occupation. Even though the Israelis will say, we no longer occupy Gaza, they absolutely do, as we know from the last 11-day war. So no, I mean, I truly feel that these communities are in grave danger of being eradicated. Some, such as the Iraqis and the Gazans, more so than the Egyptians, who are more, I would say, more assimilated into the society, and who are more, I'd say, discriminated against than actively persecuted than, let's say, the Iraqi Christians who ISIS wanted to destroy. Clearly, they wanted them off the face of the earth. Now, Chris, one thing I'd kind of say, as you said, it's a very bleak book, but yet it's also about resilience. It is first and foremost about how these people have clung on to their faith for 2,000 years, despite everything, despite purges, despite plagues, despite armies, including most recently the Islamic State, who were probably the most terrifying army I've encountered in my many years of working with their brutal tactics. They're still there. They're rebuilding their churches. The churches are full in Northeast Syria now. But we need to recognize that these people need protection drastically, and they need us to know what is going on there. That's the first step in helping them, I think.
There's two things that really stood out for me that that I haven't already mentioned in terms of why I really love the book. And one of it is the way that you very much, unlike some people, situate the Christians of the Middle East within their own communities and societies, that they're not some sort of a part, they're not, another, and they're very much part of it. Do you fear that is changing or anything? Is there, are we seeing, with identitarian politics, etc., that there's a real threat that they are considered somehow not part of Iraq or not part of, Syrian community, etc.?
Absolutely. I mean, I think it's very interesting because the minorities, especially in the Middle East, are so vital. And, if you trace the Jewish community of Iraq, the Jews of Baghdad, who are such an important part of the community, who were basically eradicated in the 50s and then the 70s. Same with the Jewish community in Alexandria in Egypt. Minorities are what make up the soul of a country. An Iraqi diplomat said to me, without the Christians in Iraq, there is no Iraq. We need these people there desperately. Now, whether or not they're assimilated into the culture, I would say, one of the reasons it's interesting, many people say, why didn't you talk about Lebanon in this book? I deliberately did not include Lebanon because Lebanese Christians are much more assimilated into society, into the government. But whereas the Iraqis, the Egyptians, the Gazans certainly are not. Now, it's interesting that Egypt, which I would say of all the countries I looked at, is probably the one, if I had to make a list of urgency of who is basically in the greatest danger, I'd probably start with Gaza and then Iraq, Egypt being like the least vulnerable. But so many of the Egyptians that I spoke to, whether or not, and socioeconomics play a big role here, because you can have extremely wealthy Christians, Copts living in Cairo, and then the extremely poor living in Minya province. But basically what they said to me is, even if they were extremely wealthy, even if they grew up with a multicultural kind of Egypt, going to the French lycée in Cairo, they still felt apart and different. And another point I made in my book is that many of these Christian groups align themselves with dictators to protect them. Now, the Christians of Iraq were basically protected by Saddam Hussein. One of his closest advisors was a Christian, of course. He basically, there was nothing formal about this, but it was a kind of deal with the devil. Give me your voting block, which is hugely important, and you will be protected from aggressive neighbors. Now, that's why one of the reasons in 2003, when I kind of start the book, when I was going to mass in Mosul, there was such a fear amongst the Christians there that if Saddam goes, who's coming next? And of course, 11 years later, on rolls the Islamic State. And I was in Baghdad, June 10th, 2014, when the first reports of the fall of Mosul were happening. Again, a kind of terror gripped. I mean, I was terrified. I wasn't so far from where they were rolling through the town. But these Christians then literally had to flee in the middle of the night with the clothes on their backs. And they went north to Kurdistan, to Erbil. Thousands of them slept underneath the statue of Our Lady or on church steps. So that began, their kind of worst nightmare. Syria, many of the Syrians I spoke to during the Christians support Bashar al-Assad. Again, same reason. He's protecting us. We want the people we know in the government rather than the black flag. And again, the brutality of the war in Syria was massive. So, I mean, these people are extremely vulnerable, extremely frightened of what could happen to them. Egypt under Mubarak protected the Christians. So there is this very strange thread of, which makes sense actually, that like these dictators who are, cruel, and in the case of Assad, enormous amounts of blood on his hands, and Saddam, and yet, they seek the protection of these leaders. So that was very interesting for me to research.
I was going to ask you about the relationship between these regimes, because yes, in a way they do sort of act as protectors, but as you say, many Christians, for example, in Aleppo, which had the largest Christian community in Syria, I mean, they suffered under the Syrian regime's bombardment. So it's a sort of very checkered relationship, between these authoritarian powers and these communities, not just Christians. You can talk about the Druze or others as well. It's really tough, I suppose, for these communities to make this pick. They know that they're not unaware of the nature of these regimes. Or do you feel differently?
Well, the same with Gaza. I mean, look, the Aleppo Christians, many of them, again, stayed till the last minute. And that bombing of Aleppo was no joke. I mean, Aleppo, I remember being there. It was December. Aleppo fell in 2016. I think I was last there in 2014. Can't remember exactly. But, Aleppo was brutally pulverized by Assad and the Russian bombers, barrel bombs, just relentless siege of that poor ancient Silk Road city. So the Christians were, bombs don't discriminate whether you're Christian or Muslim. So they were right in the middle of it. Same with the Christians in the 11-day bombing last May in Gaza, Chris, a bombing that you and I followed very closely with great anger and indignation. Again, when the Israelis bomb saying they're going to root out Hamas, the bombs don't discriminate between civilians, between children. More than 240 people were killed, 67 of them kids. So they're absolutely not Hamas supporters. And the Christians are, there's only 800 Christians in Gaza. This is a tiny, tiny number, really struggling to hold on. I'm just seeing questions come up, and there's something Abigail Absal Metzger just asked something, which is really tied into what you just asked, Chris. She's in New York, and she said there's much reported about the eradication of Jewish communities, but why is there not more talked about the Christian communities? Really good question, which is why I wrote the book, I think. I think that so many, Christianity is the predominant faith in the US. But yet so many of these mega churches, especially the evangelical community, have absolutely no idea that in the land of the prophets, in the land where Jesus Christ was born, in the land where there was where the prophets walked and tried to spread the religion and evangelicized, there is very little awareness of what is happening to these people, which is why the visit by Pope Francis to Iraq last spring, for me, was one of the most moving things I'd seen, because what he was saying, and, Francis went there at the height of COVID. He's an elderly man. He's a bit fragile. He was advised by all of his advisors not to go to Iraq. It's dangerous. He was going to say an open air mass, can't control the security. It was the height of COVID. Many Iraqis are not vaccinated, and yet he went. So what did that do? What was that singular act? To me, that sent a really clear message, and it's the message all of us who have any concern for these people need to send, which is that we're watching. We are watching. We've got your back. As for me, I advocate for more clear policy to protect these people and for more education and economic incentives that will keep young Christians in the region. Because the greatest enemy isn't really ISIS, it's migration. It's the fact that there is no work and no clear incentive for young people to stay. In Gaza, unemployment is 80%. Now, that is not because people are lazy. On the contrary, Gazans are amongst the most well-educated and hardworking people I know, and resilient and resourceful. It's because there is no work. So why can't we begin to have educational incentives and economic incentives that keep people Christians in Mosul, in Gaza, in Northeast Syria, in Aleppo? Why can't businesses have outsourcing in these places? Why can't we begin to train people to have small businesses, entrepreneurship? So these are just some thoughts about, policies that could be put in place by Western governments, the US, the UK, France, that have a clear cause. They care about it. The French church, for instance, is very involved in Christians in the Middle East. But we need to have more pragmatic approaches to help these people. Again, sorry, another long-winded answer.
No, it's very interesting. And I think that was the other thing that I really liked about your book, is that there's so many people, when they discuss Christians in the Middle East, that they have one particular answer as to why Christians are leaving. If you talk to the Israeli government, it is because of Hamas. It's always Hamas. It's like the occupation doesn't exist. If you talk to some of the representatives of other regimes in the region, it'll also be ISIS and the other hardline Islamist groups. Some people will put it down to what you've just talked about, the economic challenges. But the one thing you did was actually to make sure that you had all of these causes. They're all in the mix there, that in terms of why it's happening. And I think that we see this enormous pull factor for people leaving the region of all communities because of the absence of hope and opportunities, etc., even amongst, the most educated. But taking you back a little bit to the United States, the other thing that strikes me always when we talk about Christians in the Middle East, outside of the region, is the way in which so many people, still sort of think that somehow, the West is the center of Christianity, that somehow Christianity is centered in Rome, that it's a Western religion, etc. And, just the shocking idea that actually Christianity originated in Palestine, and all these early churches. You tell people there's, you went to some of the oldest, the monastery in Iraq at Marmoti, and, you go to Malula, they speak Aramaic. And it's sort of shocking to them. But this attitude in the United States in particular, but you get it here in Britain and elsewhere in Europe, somehow where, you put Christians first. We must sort of save the Christians uniquely, and you certainly don't put this, but somehow at the expense of all the others, the sort of Mike Pences of this world, pushing forward through this evangelical lens. How do we reach out to them? How do we reach out to these people who really profoundly don't understand properly the challenges facing the very communities you wrote about and visited and lived with?
Okay, so Mike Pence. First of all, let's never forget that an evangelical Christian president, George Bush, invaded Iraq and also used the unfortunate term, which he later then apologized for, as crusades. So I had to be really careful writing this book. As someone that works in the Middle East for decades and loves the Middle East, I did not want it to write a book that could be used by the far-right evangelicals and the extreme Zionist communities that Christians and Muslims could not live together. I did not want to paint a picture. I mean, Hamas is always used as the boogeyman in every scenario. Whenever we talk about what the appalling humanitarian conditions in Gaza, what comes up first with any Israeli government official is Hamas, 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 not looking at people as individuals who are suffering there. So one thing I really tried to do is, okay, yes, the issues here, the challenges Christians are facing in the Middle East are radical groups, extremists. So right now in Iraq, there's big fear about pro-Iranian militias, but also Turkish airstrikes. Second, migration, economic concerns. Third, but in becoming more important, climate change. Now, the Middle East is basically, global warming is happening twice as fast in the Middle East as anywhere else. Iraq is one of the 5th most vulnerable countries that the UN is looking at. We have issues of livelihood. So for instance, many of the Christians of Iraq were farmers, and their irrigation tubes, or whatever you call them, the devices they use, were destroyed by ISIS, who basically, when they came in, the Islamic State gave these Christians a choice: convert or die, or turn over all your land, your factories. So farming has been, drastically damaged by ISIS and climate change. The great rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates, the livelihood alongside these rivers is people are in danger there. I remember, as you know, in the Middle East, especially in Iraq, in the summer, you sleep on the rooftop because it's so hot. And I remember one of my last trips there in the summertime, even at like 3 a.m. in northern Iraq, it was 104 degrees still. So, drastic climate change. I was in Gaza in August, a few months ago, to basically document the damage from the last bombing. But the water situation, the increase in temperatures going drastically off the charts, all of this is something as well that these people are suffering from. So Mike Pence, when I started this book, I was working at the Council on Foreign Relations in America, and I actually had to go give a briefing to his chief of staff about what I had seen amongst the Iraqi Christians. And they are concerned, but I do think the evangelicals, who, as you know, have this strange relationship with the extreme pro-settler movements in Israel. So they're far more concerned about beating back any kind of Palestinian rights for self-determination than they are about protecting their fellow Christians. And it's very strange. And as to people not knowing that the Middle East was the birthplace of Christ, I'll tell you a very funny story. I mean, 25 years ago, I was at the American colony in Jerusalem, sitting in a garden with a correspondent from one of the biggest papers in Britain, which shall go unnamed, who said, "I just realized I've only just found out that Jesus Christ was a Jew." So I think most people study or most people grow up with religion, but they're often unaware that the roots of it are in the Middle East, not just Christ being born in a stable in Bethlehem, but, the time of the prophets, the time of the zealots, and of the biblical history, which I do go a bit into in the book. So yes, that is an interesting point.
I once actually was with a very senior former politician now in the middle of Bethlehem in Manger Square, and he looked to me and whispered, "Chris, remind me, what happened here?" At first I was, confused as to what he meant, but realized he was actually referring to what had happened historically 2,000 odd years ago. But anyhow, the levels of ignorance, I'm afraid, are still one of our biggest challenges.
I went to Catholic school my whole life, and Christmas time, we were given an Advent calendar, and we were told we were waiting for the birth of Christ to commemorate, December 25th, and we had little mangers, but no one actually explained to me what was happening 2,000 years ago in that part of the world, that Jesus Christ, was considered a zealot, and that there were many, many, many other zealots wandering through Galilee and through the region and walking across the desert to Egypt to gather faith. So, I mean, really kind of rather extraordinary period of time, the birth of Christianity.
All that indeed today Bethlehem is a city surrounded by a wall and overcrowded and with massive unemployment and various issues. Now we have some questions. I'm going to read the first one out because I'm not sure who the person is here, but the question always arises: do you think the scholarships for studying and facilitating visas and migration to the West by church patriarchates in Arab countries, do these contribute to the reduction of numbers of Christians in Arab countries? So do we make it too easy for them to leave?
Yeah, okay, so this is a really difficult issue. In 2016, when President Trump passed his awful Muslim ban, not allowing Arab Muslims to come, or Muslims anywhere, to come to the US, but making a provision that Christians could come, Arab Christians, I was deeply concerned because I thought this sent a very a terrible message, which is that there are good refugees and bad refugees. Good refugees and migrants are Christians, bad are Muslims. Now, when we give scholarships or when we try to help young people get out of their countries, we are indeed doing something extraordinary, which is educating them. But the hope is that they'll go back. And often they do not. For instance, right now, there is a huge number of young Gazans who are in Istanbul. I have one friend there who is an extraordinary, I mean, every time I talk to him, I think this is the future leader. This is someone that should be leading Palestinian politics in 10 years. But they're outside, and they're outside for a reason, because it's unbearable to live in Gaza, unbearable. But yet, if they fall into this trap of this kind of longing and nostalgia, which Edward Said and other great writers in exile have always written about. This torn, should I be back in my country doing something there on the ground, or do I stay outside so that I can breathe and I can live? Now, Christians going to the UK, going to Canada, going to the US, it's a very difficult decision. And back in 2014, at the early days of ISIS, I remember when I was in Baghdad going right to see one of the Chaldean high officials of the Chaldean church and saying he was in despair because he was getting all of these phone calls from people saying, what should we do? Should we leave? I have a cousin in Canada. I have a cousin in Manchester. I have a cousin in New Jersey. Can we go? Should we go? And he didn't know what to say, because on one hand, if your life is threatened, you should flee. But on the other hand, every Christian family that left Iraq at that period made a dent in these ancient people being rooted to their ancestral land. So, and they were doing precisely what the Islamic State wanted them to do, to flee. So it's a terrible conundrum. It's an issue that I think, unless, again, going back to my point that we need to put educational facilities and economic incentives on the ground so that they stay and that they continue to live there, and their children and their grandchildren and their great-grandchildren will flourish and build larger communities. This really is our only hope to keep these communities growing.
We have a question from Ian McWilliam. Ian, are you there?
Yes, I'm here.
Hi. Do you want to put your question to Janine?
Well, it was something you've already touched on a bit earlier, Janine. Is the problem in the West is many people tend to see Christianity as a problem. And we have this feeling that, in foreign countries, well, we need to look after the Muslims and the other minorities, but people aren't really aware of this issue that Christians are the groups that suffer most in much of the Middle East. And I was just wondering, how can you counteract that, I would say, anti-Christian prejudice we tend to have in many Western countries at the moment?
Well, I guess my answer would be, as a writer, writing this book and trying to get it into the hands of as many faith-based leaders that I can, who can in some way, again, like going back to the Pope's visit, I thought that sent an incredibly strong message. So if you yourselves are in any Christian communities, wherever you are, if you can somehow, and I'm not promoting my book, I'm just promoting that you raise the awareness, because I truly believe, for instance, my mother is a devout Catholic. And, when I gave her my book to read, she said, I had absolutely no idea that it was this bad there. And she said, it was almost like we're going back to the time of the Romans and the persecution of Christians. Well, they're not being thrown into the lion's den, but yet when ISIS came through, ISIS's tactics were unbelievably cruel and barbaric. So I think from my point of view, I'm not a government official, but I am an advocate, and I am a human rights investigator. So my job is to document what is there, bring to you the facts, the stories, the narratives, and then all of you to take it and spread it. The more people know about it, the more people talk about it, the more it gets to be on policy agendas for governments. And that's the way the cycle goes. So I've done my little tiny part of the process. Now I kind of have to leave it to all of you.
We're certainly going to help try to promote this and to promote that policy debate that I think is really necessary, and a nuanced one, not one that is governed by prejudice. I think that's very important. You mentioned the Pope, and I just wanted to say, I think the Pope's work with the Sheikh of Al-Azhar has also been very important, reaching out as head of the Roman Catholic Church, the largest Christian denomination there, with what many people might see as the sort of central space for Sunni Islam. Of course, it's not so hierarchical. I think that's been really important. So I think that the Pope does deserve a lot of credit, perhaps a little bit more so than his predecessor, who on several occasions stirred things up. Now, I'm going to move on to Stephen Booth has got a question. Stephen?
Yes, good afternoon, Chris, and good afternoon, Professor di Giovanni. I wondered if your research has extended to other religious minorities, such as the Yazidis, which suffered who suffered quite appallingly at the hands of ISIS. Have you looked at their condition at all?
Absolutely. Thank you for that question. Yes, I started working with the Yazidis way back in the time of Saddam. In 2003, I was given permission, which was very difficult in those days, to drive from Baghdad to Mosul and then north to the Yazidi villages. Now, the Yazidis were drastically persecuted under Saddam. So I really wasn't supposed to be doing this. And another webinar, I'll talk someday about what it was like working under Saddam Hussein. But I then also worked extensively with the Yazidis during the ISIS time and post-ISIS. So one very interesting thing that happened with the Yazidis is that, tiny minority, vastly misunderstood as devil worshippers, when they worship, in fact, the peacock god as a fallen angel. It was that during the ISIS time, they got a huge amount of press because, and this is how journalism is so fickle, a lot of TV crews were there. So they witnessed the Yazidi enormous suffering of them being driven out of their villages, and they were on Mount Sinjar seeking protection from ISIS. And then, of course, there was the horrific issue of Yazidi women being sold, being taken to Raqqa, sold in slave markets, and being used as sex slaves. And one of the most moving and disturbing things I witnessed was Yazidi men who were trying to save these women. And I remember sitting with one of them in a cafe in Dohuk, northern Iraq. And we were watching in real time a slave market in Raqqa. This was at the height of the ISIS time. And we were watching, it was just, I felt literally sick to my stomach. We were watching on his cell phone, young boys and women being sold as slaves. And what this man did was he organized the women to be saved, to be rescued. And they did it by, it was extraordinary, actually. They used like the door-to-door salesmen who would go to the doors selling feminine products to the ISIS households. And they would get messages to the Yazidi women, you know, be at this corner at this time. And then under great secrecy and courage, they would get them out and get them home. Now, another really interesting thing about the Yazidi community is that I've worked with victims of sexual violence in wartime for many, many years, going back to the Bosnian rape camps and Rwanda and other places where rape is used as a weapon of war. Absolutely horrific. Most of the time, when women return to these communities, they're shunned, and they're basically, you know, because these are usually strict religious communities and these women have been raped, they're usually horribly kind of pushed outside of society. But the Yazidis, their leader made basically an announcement that we're going to protect these women. We're going to welcome them back. We're going to take them to our, you know, embrace them. And then it helped with Nadia Murad, who was a Yazidi woman who had been abducted, taken to Raqqa, used as a sex slave, that she became the face of the Yazidis, and of course won the Nobel Prize. So, so that the Yazidis did get, I think, quite a lot of coverage, and deservingly so. Much more coverage than the Christians have gotten.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I've got a question from Bernie Howley about the ratio of Christians to other. Has it changed in Syria since the war started?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there was, again, I'm not a big one on numbers. I've never, you know, when people say how many people died or like, you know, for instance, we stopped counting the dead in Syria in 2016. So we have no idea how many people have been killed so far. Again, Syrian Christians did number in the last census close to 10%. But we don't know now, because places like Malula, which I write about in the book, which is a Christian kind of enclave on the road to Homs, has been overrun so many times by government troops, by al-Nusra, by ISIS, back in government hands. So people left. And there has not been a real counting or census since then. And of course, Syria is still at war. We often forget that, right? It's been going on since 2010, and most people don't know that there is still, officially, there has not been a peace deal. Syria is still at war. So really no idea of the numbers. And the other issue, so many people are displaced. Millions and millions and millions of people in Syria have been forcibly removed from their homes and, you know, sent to different parts of the country or fled to different parts of the country. So I think it's going to be decades before we get any clear indication of what the population is. Same with Copts. We really don't know, anywhere between 6% and 10%. The one group we do know, just because it's easier to count, are the Christians in Gaza, where we have 800. Again, that might be, you know, give or take.
Thank you. I think that's absolutely spot on. I think it's so difficult when you have a country like Syria where half the population has been displaced or landed up in exile. I mean, the whole of Syria is suffered in that, and Christians as part of it, which I might just invite Nadim Nassar, my friend Nadim. Are you there? You have a comment in the chat.
Thank you, Chris, and thank you very much, Professor, for the book and for this event. Yes, I agree. The attention that the West gives to the Christians in even the churches in the West to Christians in the Middle East is appalling. Because when I came first to Europe as a Syrian, I was shocked when people and clergy started asking me, when did you become Christian, Father? Because they assumed that I was a Muslim and became Christian. And slowly I realized that they meant it. That they have no idea about the history and the presence of Christianity in the Middle East. And the politics in the West, whether Europe or North America, the last thing on their agenda is any faith in the Middle East, whether Christians or Muslims or Shia or Sunni. What they have on their agenda is their interests, their agenda. So once the group fits the agenda, they are interested. If we don't fit the agenda, they are totally uninterested. And in the foreign office, they told me, one of the ministers in the foreign office in this country, in Britain, he said, Father, it's not about friendship, it's about interests. And unfortunately, the evangelical Christians in America, they are only interested to pay millions and millions and millions if you speak about evangelization of Muslims. But they have no interest whatsoever. I go to America 3 times a year, sometimes more. If you say we want to support the presence of the Christians in there, not interested. If you say, well, my organization works to evangelize the Muslims there, the money is there. But of course, they support the weirdest groups in Syria and Iraq. The Awareness Foundation, we work in Syria and Iraq and Lebanon. And we encounter the most outlandish groups, Christian groups, swimming with money to support what's so-called evangelization, which all 98% false and out of this world. So thank you for the book, which I hope will increase the awareness of the Western societies about what is happening, because even with the internet and the communications, the ignorance is still incredible. Thank you very much, and I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Father Nadim. And I would be very happy to get you some copies of the book to try to get to reach, faith-based leaders. You are absolutely right. There is this weird, the US State Department spends millions and millions on something called religious freedom, supporting minorities on religious freedom. And yet what it seems to me at its very heart is to kind of promote, I don't want to say anti-Muslim, but to kind of, rather than to say, let's investigate how we can actually tangibly help these people. It's much more about fighting radical Islam, which is why while I was writing this book, I was so conscious of doing this. And I actually found myself being courted by extreme Zionist groups. They love the idea of this book. They absolutely love the idea that, Christians are being eradicated by crazy Muslims. And I really had to push back hard on that. Like, no, that's not what this is about. Christians and Muslim communities have lived together for thousands and thousands of years peacefully. This is about other issues. This is about the rise of radicalization. And radicalization, as we know, has its roots in many sources, one of which is deep frustration. And I'm not talking about ISIS here. I'm really talking more about Palestine. The occupation of the West Bank and Gaza has had, repercussions that have gone on, especially for young people who have known nothing but frustration and humiliation their entire lives. But anyway, back to your point, Father. I absolutely think, as you say, like the support of these weird evangelical groups to convert is deeply worrying, because they're not really looking at how do we protect these Aramaic speaking tiny communities in Iraq or Syria, or these tiny communities in Gaza. They're looking more about how do we spread the word of Jesus Christ to convert Muslims to Christianity. Like, for instance, in Afghanistan, that was the very tiny Christian community there are all converts. So thank you so much for your point, and thank you for the work that you do. And if there's any way that I can help, please let me know, because my main message here is this book is not about Christians and Muslims not being able to live together. On the contrary, it's about the great love that was between neighbors and communities, and how we can support people to remain in their ancestral lands, because they are absolutely vital and urgent. And earlier, Chris, you said to me, why write this now? This book is a call to action. It's a call that in 100 years, these people might not be on the planet anymore. And I felt that I had to document them now so that people will say, we cannot let them disappear. We absolutely must protect them. So thank you again, Father, for your
Thank you. And 100 years, you are very optimistic. I don't think we will last 100 years. It's another century. Well, in Palestine, in Jerusalem is 0.005% Christians. I don't think we will last 100 years, but I hope we are resilient, as you said, and we will reinvent ourselves and present ourselves in a different way. Thank you, Chris, for your patience.
Thank you, Nadeem. And it's such an important point. And I'm glad, Janine said what she did, because I think that, those Muslim-Christian relations are so warm. And one's always reminded it only takes a relatively small number of extremists to really cause such horror and atrocities. But the overwhelming majority of people don't behave like that at all. And, I'm reminded that even Donald Trump once said in Saudi Arabia, that very first counterterrorism conference, that Muslims are the biggest victims of ISIS, in terms of numbers. And it's true. They too have suffered massively because they're not the right type of Muslim. We're going to take a final couple more questions. There is one question from Pat Gaffney. Pat?
Yes, hello. Thank you very much, Janine. And I ask this as a sister Roman Catholic, but a very progressive one. I'm interested in the role that women religious play in the region. I've met many wonderful Dominicans from Iraq, many more in Palestine from different traditions and backgrounds. And they're not sectarian. They're working in health, in education, with refugees. They're amazingly open. And I just wondered if you felt that such community groups, and women in particular, might have a distinct role to play in kind of creating and building the sticking power that's needed in these communities, but also that they could have an advocacy role as internationals.
Thank you, Pat. I'm going to take a couple of questions, Janine. So there's that one on women for you. So we can wrap up. I'm going to take a question from Robin Dacey about Palestinian Christians. Robin?
Sorry, it wasn't really a question. I was actually pointing out that although I would be interested to know what's actually happening lately, I haven't been there since 2016, but I pointed out that the Joint Advocacy Initiative is a very interesting example of what can be done and what is being done. And they have had, for example, the group that persuaded the Presbyterian Church in the United States to actually disinvest from certain firms was a group that joined up to go on that initiative tour. So I think that, I mean, that's really my point. I'd be interested to know what she thinks the future is of the Palestinian Christians, and my apologies for being late.
Right, and we got a question also from John McHugo. John, are you there?
Yes, thank you very much, Chris, and thank you, Janine, for a very, very interesting talk. I think to some extent you've probably covered my question already, and I think we're very much on the same page. But would you agree that much of the problem ultimately stems from Islamophobia in the West, something that perhaps goes back to the Chanson de Roland and so on? And it means that the Christian communities of the Middle East are sort of tainted with guilt by association whenever the West does something ghastly. And if you go back to the early days of Arab nationalism, Christians and Muslims, and also to an extent, I think, Jews, were all on the same page. And that has changed over the last 100, 120, 140 years, to a very large extent, because of sometimes well-intentioned, more often perhaps not well-intentioned Western initiatives. And this has made the position of these Christian communities very difficult indeed.
Thank you very much, John. So, Janine,
yeah,
to wrap up with those three.
Yeah. Okay. So I'll start with Pat. I was educated by Dominican nuns, so I have a place in my heart for them. Absolutely, that, you know, it's interesting. The nuns of Malula that I spent time with were Orthodox. They were very pro-Assad, which might have been coming from fear of saying too much, but that was quite shocking for me. Although, again, that goes back to them being protected by Assad. But the women, the nuns you're talking about who are working within the community, my strong belief and my hope for peace in the Middle East, in my lifetime, I hope I see some semblance of it, is that women, communities, faith-based leaders are used more in the peacemaking process. I believe strongly that for wars to end, it being done at an elite level, that is the UN and governments, there has to be some kind of pipeline coming from people on the ground. So these nuns that you're talking about that are working directly with refugees and communities that know this is what we need to survive. These people are hugely important. Second question for Robin about the Palestinian Christians. Again, my book focuses solely on Gazan Christians. And the reason for that is what you said about your family from Bet Sahur. I think that Christians in the West Bank suffer the same fate that their Muslim Palestinian brethren do. They're basically subjected to the same kind of humiliation, but they're not. Gazans have a particular challenge, which is that the restriction of movement, that they cannot leave the Gaza Strip, which is, of course, only 7 miles by 14 miles, and there's 2 million people there. So they additionally have this. John, Islamophobia. I mean, you're absolutely right that so much of it stems from that. And there was someone else, Omar, I believe, Omar Shama, said the evangelical anti-Muslim approach is a divide and rule approach. They are trying to divide peaceful Christian and Muslim communities. So this goes back to my point of, while I was writing, how absolutely sensitive I was to the fact that I did not want to paint this as an anti-Muslim book. And Chris made the point that ISIS harmed, but if we're going by numbers, the Muslims were their primary target. Well, Muslims, Yazidis, Christians, but many, many, many Muslim people were directly affected by their horror. So I think I got all three of those questions.
Thank you so much, Janine. Before I formally thank you, just a few announcements. In fact, Janine mentioned the issue of climate change, and I'm really glad she did, because we at Caabu think that's such a huge issue now. It's not looked at much in the Middle East. So we have our second event of the year on climate change coming up on the 16th of December. So do tune in. We've got some excellent speakers and register that. That'll be our last event of 2021. So join us for that. Thank you also to everybody on the chat for all your questions and brilliant points that you've made. It's certainly helped to make this a fantastic event. And for those who haven't, please do join Caabu as a member. All the details are on the website. We'd love you to do that. So Janine, thank you very much. A reminder to everybody, the book is out. It's very attractive. It's a very good read. And I would heartily say that it will make an excellent present for all your friends and relatives over Christmas and beyond. It's beautifully well written, as one would expect from somebody so eloquent. Thank you very much, Janine. We look forward to spreading the word, and also your future work as well. Your work on Gaza and other stuff is always illuminating. Thank you, everybody. It was a great pleasure.
Thank you, everyone. Blessed holiday season.